Good morning. I'm delighted to be with you here to open the second day here at our event. The amphitheatre is almost full. I'm sure, as you've understood, given the heat, it's better to attend the morning debates. I can see some members of my team. Jean-Marc OLLAGNIER is here, the head of my team. I'd like to say hello to him. So we're going to talk about decarbonisation, and I'm sure that that's what you're interested in, and that's what brings you here so early in the morning to attend this seminar. There's a wonderful panel here, and we're going to talk about different solutions, not only the problem. So we are going to take a closer look, not only at the nature of the problem, but how we can introduce short and longer-term solutions. You know Europe's ambitions, which are very commendable, tied in with the obligations to reduce by 55% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 2019. Today we're at minus 20, and that minus 20 is taking us 30 years to do. So if we want to achieve our targets, we've got quite a steep gradient. It's a very steep slope. Second piece of context, it's very strange for someone of my generation to imagine addressing this assembly and saying we are at war. Of course, there's an economic aspect to that, but we have our main supplier of coal, petrol and gas, and that's the attacking party, of course. So here there are some constraints kicking in, and that brings into question some guarantees that prices will go up, they will be unstable, and we are sure also that we won't have enough of those commodities. So we are now rediscovering the problems of insecurity of supply chain, which we thought were behind us because of the different market mechanisms which are in place. So if here in X we want to see the glass half full, and we don't have the choice. We are on an old continent which has burned most of its oil and gas, and it's going to have a high cost of decarbonisation. There's going to be like a tax carbon which is going to come into play, and that will mean that we have to deploy new solutions more quickly, and you'll hear about some of those solutions this morning. Of course, society has to remain stable, coherent, despite this shock, and that is the big issue of the transition. We've already talked about this, and we will come back to it later. We've got a fabulous panel here. We're going to hand the floor first of all to Mauricio CARDENAS, who is a professor at Columbia University in New York. And he is part of a big energy policy research unit at the university. And he, above all, was Minister of Finance in Colombia. And what interests us even more is that he was Minister for Mines and Energy and many other things. Mauricio, the floor is yours.
English, because it's only 5 minutes, I think it'll be more efficient. I'd like to make 3 points to start the conversation. Point number one, we're living in a world where the energy transition is now moving into a second position relative to the issues of energy security. There was a panel at Davos, and the audience had a poll to answer on what were the main concerns. Affordability of energy, security of energy, or climate action. And the answers were leaning towards affordability. This means that we're widening the gap between ambition, and the highest level of ambition was the COP26 in Glasgow, and reality. So point number one is we need to narrow the gap between ambition and reality. Point number two, the climate crisis is not the only crisis we're living through. We're seeing in the discussions yesterday, the food crisis, hunger is a real issue as well. We have cyber warfare. We have issues related to security. There are a number of crises overlapping at the same time. They're more interdependent than ever. The climate crisis is resulting in food crisis. The food crisis causes health issues. So these interdependencies are really remarkable. And these are tail risk events that are occurring at the same time. And the most important aspect of this new generation of crisis is that they're truly global. And we are ill-equipped to deal with these new crises because the multilateral system that we designed was able to provide public goods at the national level, but all these crises require global public goods. And we still do not have the system that is able to provide the global public goods that we require. Reducing carbon emissions is essentially a global public good. We need the coordination and we need to ensure that we have the governance structure to provide the global public goods. The current multilateral system is adequate in helping countries develop their own public goods, but not necessarily to ask the world to provide the global public goods. And point number 3 is that one way of reconciling the level of ambition in terms of energy transition and climate action and reality in today's world is reducing energy demand. We're very concerned about supply. We're very concerned about developing new sources of fossil fuels. This has been pretty much the central issue of the conversation this year, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. But demand is equally important. Just to give you a fact, if we reduce heating by 1 degree Celsius, we'll save 10 billion of cubic meters of natural gas. And what President Biden offered to Germany was 15 billion cubic meters of natural gas. So this just shows that the orders of magnitude are quite impressive in terms of the reduction in demand, reduction in the use of vehicles, reduction, better insulation of our building, et cetera, et cetera. The shift today towards more supply of fossil fuels, especially with the developments of new facilities to import LNG, is necessary. We all understand. It's the pragmatic response to a crisis. But it's not the long-term solution. Something that is much more consistent and compatible with the energy transition is to reduce energy demand. There are many ways in doing that. One is to ask the population to take the measures in a voluntary way. But of course, price signals are always very important. And I think we're in a threshold where we could take this opportunity to, at the global level, certainly, reduce energy subsidies and increase energy taxation, and particularly carbon taxation. The coordination associated with carbon taxation is necessary. We need the adequate governance at the global level to go in this direction. But certainly, we will not help the cause of climate action and the energy transition if we continue responding to the current crisis with very high energy subsidies. And I think this is essentially the main concern that I have as a result of the current situation with the global energy markets. So main message here is let's put the focus on energy demand and let's make sure that we provide enough incentives for people to substitute away from fossil fuels at these very difficult times for the energy markets. So I'll stop here.
Merci beaucoup, Mauricio.
Thank you very much for placing your accent on demand. Of course, here in Aix, we often focus on solutions that are brought to us thanks to technology. But yes, we must address the question of demand. And the question of price is also very important. I'm going to hand the floor now to Xavier PIECHACZYK, who I'd like to thank very much. We're all here and we're shedding light on this subject thanks to Xavier and RTE, which is the French network that provides or that conveys electricity. And so we're going to try and list the different tensions that exist and will exist in the future for electricity in Europe. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Patrice. Hello. I'm going to start by saying that, well, I'd like to thank Mauricio, and I'm going to concentrate on France and Europe, if that's okay with you. In Europe and in France, we are inundated with objectives. There are so many of these goals that we've got to attain. In Europe, we've got to reduce our CO2, we've got to increase our energy efficiency, etc., etc. That's for 2030. For 2050, there are another series of zero net carbon targets and a lot of transfer towards electricity. Up to 2020, we were in a happily globalized world. We had lots of ambitions, but neither France nor Europe were respecting these goals. In 2020, 21, 22, three things happened. We had COVID, which really put pressure on the European and national markets. There was the war in Ukraine, and here in France, our nuclear facilities suffered corrosion. So as well as there being tension in gas and oil, there's also a pressure on the production of electricity here in France. So from that happily globalized world we were in, where we had these lovely goals that no one was striving towards because we were all very comfortable, now all of a sudden we are plunged into a rather complicated globalization with three events which have created tensions, very strong tensions, as Patrice has said. And we can see these tensions on the terms of price of oil and gas, but also the price of electricity. Everything is involved. These three sectors are interconnected, and there are different generating facts which explain why 3 years later prices are through the roof, and we simply do not have enough energy being produced in all three categories that I've mentioned. So one could say, oh, this is a catastrophe, but I think we have to use catastrophes to draw good conclusions. So we've got COVID, we've got the nuclear question in France, and we've got the war in Ukraine. We could use these three elements to make everyone be aware of what the situation is. But I'm not sure that that will be the case. I don't think we would be talking about sobriety as much 2 years ago if we had not been collectively faced with these three elements. So I want to turn these dramas into good news. We're talking about sovereignty, efficacy, sobriety, and flexibility. Mauricio has said we have to be concerned with the flexibility in terms of demand also. So we've got these three crises, which were in 2021 and 22. Today, there's a lot of stress between our climate objectives and our supply security requirements. Have we got enough energy to continue living normally? In all honesty, the question remains open. We've got some winters coming up. Who knows whether they'll be easy or difficult to survive? But before I yield the mic, I just want to refer to two different periods. The three crises I've talked about, they are taking us into a world of 22 to 25 where where it's going to be a world of differences. We're going to have to work differently and accept these gaps. It's a world of gaps, if you like. Germany is going to be opening coal power stations. France is, because there's a lot of stress on its electricity network, it's also talking about opening up a coal power station. So there are lots of gaps there, gaps in our trajectory. We're heading in more or less the right direction, but we're not going very fast. We have to take advantage of this. During this time of gaps with CO2, we have to talk about transferring massive usage to decarbonated solutions, and we have to get ready for that right now in the next 2 or 3 years, which are going to be the years of those gaps. So 24, 25, in the hypothesis where tension in gas supplies soothes down, we're going to have to get back to our initial trajectory. It will be a high step to climb, but we realize that consuming energy costs a lot of money. It begs the question of sovereignty, and it's all about demand as well. And we are going to have to be very agile. And what does that mean? That means that we're going to have to change our regulatory models. We're going to have to develop new price incentives. We are going to have to be much faster on our feet. The operators, the governments, and all of those who have an impact on demand are all going to have to be faster on their feet. We have some hydrogen producers in the room with us here. We've got those who are involved with heat production, those who do renovations, etc. So we all have to be on board, and we're all going to have to find resources and incentives in technology so that as soon as we get out of these years of those gaps, we will as quickly as possible be able to get back onto a trajectory where we are in control of demand in light of the different challenges. And my company has committed to that with goals for 2030 and 2050. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Xavier, very much for talking about those stresses and tensions, but having done part of my work by explaining what's going to happen next. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Benoît Potier, who's going to talk about air liquide. The big challenge in coming years is to find a solution for replacing 150 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. And when we take a look at Europe's plans, it's called Repower EU. Out of that amount, we only can get together 50. So i.e. that's a third of the replacement solutions. Other solutions will be elsewhere other than gas. Hello, thank you for being here this morning. I'm going to start to talk about decarbonisation before I talk about hydrogen as a solution. There is decarbonisation because there has been carbonisation. And there was carbonisation because in nature, oxygen fixes onto carbon to create life or to maintain life. We breathe, we need fire. We've needed that for many, many years. And we use these elements in many processes. So how can we backtrack? Nature has advanced, man has advanced, but we need to backtrack now. And I would just like to get back to this famous quote whereby nothing is lost, nothing is created, everything is simply transformed. And that is what decarbonisation is all about. How can we manage to backtrack? So it's a medium to long-term question. All of the businesses that I interact with are looking at this, irrespective of their sector. They want to decarbonize by 2030. So I think that's a great achievement over the past 5 years. But in the shorter term, we have to be very proactive. We know today that we are acting today to work towards decarbonisation. So the question of timing is perhaps not in everyone's mind. But businesses have started to work on that question of timing. Decarbonisation reshuffles all of the energy cards. Right from the very outset, we've been talking about energy rather than carbon or decarbonisation. And that would encourage us to go and seek out new energies, not only renewable energies, but all other types of energy. And it completely reshuffles the cards of geopolitics in terms of energy. There are some solutions which one might envisage today, local or global solutions. And that's a really important factor. And it also shuffles the cards in terms of consumption. We talk about sobriety a lot here in France. So in the problem of decarbonisation, you have to address all of those questions. In sectors that emit carbon, when you look at China, the United States, Europe and France, the breakdown of carbon emissions are very, very different. In France, for example, electricity production accounts for 12% of emissions. These figures from the French government, whereas in China, or rather the rest of the world, it's 41%, in China 51%. So emissions per country vary greatly. And when you take a look at solutions, we immediately see that energy production is one factor, but we've also got transport. And here is another opportunity for finding solutions. I would just like to say that decarbonisation technologies do exist today. However, you have to be pretty smart. For ages, we weren't really taking any notice of carbon, and it was getting involved in all kinds of industrial processes. To go and seek out your carbon, you have to first of all not dilute it into the atmosphere in all of these gases that are produced by industry. In cars with their emissions, etc. You have to be able to capture carbon. You have to transform industrial processes to try and concentrate the carbon and capture it more easily. All of these technologies do exist. However, we have to scale it up, and we're not yet scaled up. To do this, what we are trying to do is to concentrate our actions to work in the biggest industrial regions, to work upstream where a lot of carbon is emitted. I'm talking about the steel industry, chemistry, oil, cement, and other industries as well, which emit a lot of carbon. So that's already started. And we're trying to do that on the great continental plates. Europe is the perfect battleground for going to seek out your carbon. North America, the same. China, Middle East. There are these plateaus, if you like. So the strategy of industry today is to go and seek that carbon wherever it is and work wherever it's very dense. A final point, there are solutions, they do exist. I'm going to move on to hydrogen any minute now because I'm already being told to stop speaking. But hydrogen is not an energy, it's an energy vector. It's an initial energy which has been transformed into hydrogen. Hydrogen is a solution that could replace 20% of energy which is consumed around the world by 2025. That means it would fulfill 20% of that journey to get rid of our CO2 emissions. These are figures that have been calculated by the Hydrogen World authorities. So there are solutions. Everybody needs electricity, but in order to have lighting and to get your machines up and running. However, all intermediate energies, which are there when they're there, but which are often surplus, they can be transformed into hydrogen, and hydrogen can be stored for many, many years, or for many seasons at least, unlike electricity, which cannot be stored in the short term. So hydrogen is a product that could replace some of the energy which we're using, and the technology to produce it exists. It's just a question of organizing the energy system. So I'm being told to stop speaking now, so I will wait for questions at the end of the session to talk more about hydrogen.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand the floor to Sylvie JÉHANNO, who is at the head of Dalkia, which is the energy services subsidiary of EDF here in France. We could talk also about hydrogen with you. You're involved in that industry sector, but perhaps you're not going to start by talking about hydrogen. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for being here so early in the morning. So, finding the decarbonisation trajectory, well, that's a big question. I'm sure you're here because that's a question which interests us all. We want to transform the world, and that is the subject which is of interest to us today. Let's not forget that we all know the objectives, but between the scenario at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, there is the ice cap, which is melting in summer every 100 years. At 2 degrees, it's every 10 years. So we know how dramatic the situation is. When we take a look at energy questions, they are so vital in our journey towards decarbonisation. Yes, electricity is the first cause of CO2 emissions in the world. However, that is not the case in France. Here in France, our energy is highly decarbonated. And we have a very clear strategy. Nuclear plus renewables equals carbon-free energy. So to respect this journey towards decarbonisation, how can we structure the journey? When we take a look at consumption of energy here in France, we see that half of consumption is devoted to producing heat. Then there's a quarter to producing electricity and the remaining quarter for transport. So what is heat? Heat is your heating, it's hot water, and it's industrial steam or vapor. So we want to decarbonate that particular heat. So how do we generate decarbonated heat? Well, we have to do two things. It's quite easy to do. Firstly, you produce low carbon, you consume low carbon, and I'm going to explain what that means. And thirdly, you consume less. And this is where we come back to this sobriety, which we're talking about all the time in France. So producing heat involves what? Well, in a city, for example, you have to have heat networks based on renewable energies. Today, we know how to create heating for people. We've got urban heating, which we're all familiar with. We can use that by recuperating waste from recuperating heat from waste. For example, we can recuperate heat. We recuperate it and inject it into hot water networks, and we can heat buildings in the city. The second option is wood. Wood can be used as an energy. You can have biomass burners, you create heat, you inject it into water, and the water heats the buildings. Wood in France is being grown in a sustainable manner. We do not import it. We go and get our wood from 50 kilometers around the plant. Wood is used normally to create roof structures and furniture, and when we use wood for heating, it's only waste wood that we use. And the wood industry is growing here. The third option is heating. We can go down 1,000 meters under the ground. We go into the sea with the lasso heating, and there are many other options. Another example for decarbonating industry, we've just heard about that. In industry, here again, we can replace our gas and fuel heaters with wood heaters, and by 2030, France is going to be spending a lot of money, 5 billion euros, which is going to be injected into decarbonating systems for producing vapor and heating. And thanks to a call for projects which are currently underway, we are going to be replacing our gas heaters by wood solutions. We use recycled wood, and if I continue to talk about this circular economy, we can have recuperation systems, and that's what remains after you've sorted your yellow recycling bins. There are some things which are recycled. You have paper, glass, plastic, etc., and then there is also always some residue. This is waste. You don't know what to do, and these are high calorie solutions for burning. You can use them in your boilers, and we've decided to do that. So here are some examples of producing heat with low carbon, and I think we really need to speed up along those lines.
The second topic is consuming less. What does that mean exactly? Dalkia is heat, it's producing thermal energy, but it's also energy savings. And energy savings involve two things: producing energy efficiency, which means substituting current technologies with technologies that are more energy efficient. For example, in the examples that you know well, when I change my gas boiler and I put an electric heat pump in, I'm massively decarbonizing my heating system and I'm consuming less. Then consuming less is something that is organized because we manage our consumption in order to consume only just we need when we need it and not to consume when it's not necessary. I'll just conclude. The electrification is a topic and is part of the solution also in France, especially where we have decarbonized electricity. I'm going to talk about some successes in decarbonization. We won't succeed this journey if we don't succeed with innovation. There's a lot of innovation in the solutions that we should set up on the ground. The second success factor is digital. Christine Lagarde said it very well yesterday. Digital consumes a lot. We know how to do it sustainably, but it's key to process data, to optimize, to manage. And I'll finish with the human aspects. Competencies, skills. Without skill, without talent, without technicians, without engineers, we won't succeed with our energy transition. And I know that all young people recently have been talking about the fact that we need to accelerate energy transition during the awarding of diplomas. That came up a lot. We need to go from claims to action, and so come work with us on energy transition.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais passer la parole à Benoit BAZIN.
I'll hand the floor to Benoit BAZIN, who's at the head of Saint-Gobain. For everyone, Saint-Gobain is double glazing. That's not surprising. You're at the head of a company that was created by Colbert as a royal glass manufacturing center. I looked at this at Wikipedia, on Wikipedia 30 seconds ago. It must be close to the truth in any case. So we've decided to focus on one of the core battles, which is efficiency in buildings and in housing. We talked about climate emergency, and what I really wanted to talk about was energy efficiency. We won't succeed with our decarbonization journey unless we work on energy efficiency. The first energy loss and carbon loss it comes from buildings, public and private buildings around the world. Roughly 40% of CO2 emissions. 120 countries have committed to energy neutrality, and we will not achieve this if we don't decarbonize buildings, if we don't work on energy efficiency of buildings. 85% of today's buildings will still be here in 2050, so we have to decarbonize them. When we work on building energy efficiency in a certain way with one stone, we're solving three problems. First, climate and CO2. Secondly, and we see this today, we're working on social justice, purchasing power, so equality, solving heating problems and insulation problems. And thirdly, we're working on our national sovereignty and energy independence. Energy renovation of buildings is the essential topic today, and we must absolutely meet these three objectives: one stone, three targets. We've been taking a long time. We've renovated 1% of buildings in Europe every year, so we're not at the right level that we need to be for crisis management. Why are we here today? We thought energy was affordable. We weren't. We're talking about Russian gas. Half of our nuclear fleet is shut down right now, so we need to move over to another way of thinking and to think in crisis mode, crisis management on all of these topics. The solutions, technical solutions exist to do the renovation of a building. We can use products that exist today to reduce energy consumption by 70 to 80%. But there are three recommendations. Firstly, move on to an investment reasoning. We often think when we look at building renovation, we're looking at costs. We now have to think more in terms of investment. European governments since September have spent 1.2, 1.3% of GDP on energy checks and tax reductions to try to lower the energy price. If we spent 0.5% of our GDP on the energy renovation, we would double the speed at which we would be renovating buildings for energy purposes. So by our tax cost for acting as a fireman putting out fires is twice as costly as investing. So let's move on to investment instead of just putting out the fires. It's true that there is a social reality that's very hard, and we need to put some fires out. Then we need to move on to global renovation. We have to renovate, we have to train, we have to develop skills. And if we're serious about building renovation, it's 600 to 800,000 jobs in France that cannot be relocated and that will have an impact on the well-being of our citizens. The third topic, and I'll conclude here, is that we need to work together. We need to cooperate. We need to stop putting topics in opposition. The best energy is the one that we don't use. Nuclear energy, we were told, costs nothing because the marginal cost is zero. That is not true anymore. It's not because we electrify energy sources. It's not because a heat pump can be a good system. If a house is poorly insulated, a heat pump won't serve much of a purpose. We need to insulate homes, electrify them, then put solar captors on. But really, we need to focus on innovation in energy efficiency for buildings. I'll stop there, but we're living through an emergency at a social level, climate level, and in terms of national independence on the energy renovation of buildings. We have to triple our speed of action now. Benoit was very efficient. He will have stopped speaking before the stop sign came up. Jean-Marc OLLAGNIer, who's the head of Accenture Europe, is kind enough to come and speak, even though everything has pretty much been said. So the challenge is to see how different sectors can cooperate and come back on the human capital that we spoke about already. Many things have been said, but I think on this route to decarbonization, the good news is that the mobilization of stakeholders is present. You as citizens, we've talked about European regulators, and companies need to be more involved. There are no solutions without decarbonization of the economy. And often companies are criticized, but we have a role to play also, a key role, and the mobilization of economic stakeholders since the COP21 in Paris and the last COP in Glasgow means that today we have 60% of economic actors that have a plan, a certified plan for decarbonization of their sector. We have all the light industry sectors, the consumption sectors, but the challenge that we have is that we still have some big industrial sectors where decarbonization is possible but not economically viable. If we talk about cement and metalworking, metallurgy, where it's not viable yet. The electrification that works well in most economic sectors is not going to apply. We need to find other solutions for these sectors. The challenge is that we're not going quickly enough. As my colleagues have said, we're not going quickly enough in industry, but none of the sectors are going quickly enough. We need to accelerate. A few observations on how to accelerate. We've talked a lot about solutions, and solutions at scale are part of this, are part of what we must do. We have a lot of solutions for 2030, but we need technological innovation. If we talk about carbon capture and electricity storage, perhaps green hydrogen at a large scale, probably small-sized nuclear plants. We need breakthrough innovations that will allow us to accelerate in the achievement of at-scale economic solutions. In particular, in heavy industry, we don't all have the solutions today that will allow us to make progress. A second topic concerns digital. I won't come back to this because you've talked about it. We need it for measurement, for optimization, but also to set up new economic models. We talk a lot about Scope 3 and carbon emissions. Really, the emissions in the widest sense of the term. We're all going to have to set up new collaborative systems, and digital can help us do this. We've seen this in cities, but also on large industrial sites. Digital will be an essential element. Then there are new business models. The circular economy will be part of the solutions that will allow us to move forward. So in terms of solutions, we're probably progressing sufficiently, but there's still a lot of work to do, and we don't have all of the solutions for 2050. The last topic I wanted to raise, as Patrick said, is the question of talent. Since we have a lot of students here, this is very relevant. Companies see that there's a war of talent right now. Digital generated this war of talent war, but we see the digital war as real today. All companies are trying to hire digital talents. But for decarbonization and the stakes of decarbonization, it's a much more important topic than digital in terms of investment, but in terms of talent. We did a survey with the European Commission. We'll need 7 million talents in the 15 coming years just for the energy aspects of decarbonization. We'll need hundreds of thousands of jobs on energy efficiency. In the same way for green hydrogen, we will need a lot more talent than we see today on the market. So there's a mobilization that's absolutely huge. There was an article in Germany this week, I don't know if you saw it, where the only concern today for decarbonization that is mentioned is that they're missing 500,000 jobs to do decarbonization in Germany. So it shows you how important these new talents are. Mobilization is help us enter into these professions. We don't have enough talents. And criticizing companies is easy because we're often part of the problem. But help us to find the right solutions. We need you. What's ahead of us is very exciting. It'll create a lot of enthusiasm, but it's also a lot of work.
Alors, on avait prévu 10 minutes de questions sans...
So we planned 10 minutes of questions, but we only have 5 minutes left. Hands will come up.
Un polo bleu et moins de 28 ans. Oui, oui. Voilà. Alors, j'ai deux polos bleus et moins de 28 ans.
Okay, we've got some nice youngsters with us, under 28, who are with us. I'm being quite the dictator here, but off you go. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the speakers for these very interesting exchanges. My question pertains to the difference in between countries in decarbonization, the difference between those countries which are developing and those which are developed. They're in different situations. Let's take a look at Colombia, for example, but also there's a difference between China and India, which allows them to pollute. So my question is, should all countries follow the same decarbonization path, or should they be on different trajectories? Okay, we'll take a second question. We'll try and group the questions. Mauricio is obviously going to answer that first question. Thank you very much for your presentations. You did not really all react to that question of the trajectories and the 5.5%. I'm just wondering what role COVID, etc., have played in taking people off their trajectories. So, first of all, when you're in an emerging country, do you have to have the same trajectory? And second question, should the war make us realize that we're never going to hit the 1.5%? Thank you for the question. The costs of
economy or emerging developing economy. We heard yesterday from the Banque de France that the estimated costs for the French economy are about 2 to 3% of GDP per year. The costs for an average country in Latin America are 5 and 6% of GDP per year to achieve net zero by mid-century. Why is it more expensive in emerging and developing countries? Well, first of all, the price of the technology is pretty much the same. Electric vehicles, the cost is the same. Solar panels, the cost is the same. their GDP base is much lower. And there's one extra element. Many of these economies depend on fossil fuels as a source of income. So the energy transition involves risks associated with losing those revenues. Therefore, it's much more challenging. And the financing aspect of the energy transition becomes crucial. Where is the money? Where is the money going to come from? It cannot be at the cost of reducing living standards in regions that are already well below the average global per capita GDP. So it's a very relevant question, again, for this global conversation.
Peut-être un éclairage sur l'Inde, Benoît?
Oui, pour un groupe international comme ça.
Tell us a little bit about India. Well, we're in 75 countries and we have got a carbon price for all of our R&D decisions, and it's the same all over the world. We have brought our carbon emissions down by 23% despite the company growing. And in India, we haven't made any distinction because these are commitments to decarbonize the entire Saint-Gobain group. So we've got a lot of incentives. In India, for example, when you take a look at our headquarters, and we use glass there, and it's the same demands in energy performance as elsewhere. International groups can have that scaling up impact, and we commit to finding solutions, and we do not think that Europe is ahead of the game. They're obviously often lagging behind in terms of creativity and solar panels, for example. India is much further ahead than some European countries. And how about the war? Is this the final nail in the coffin of the 1.5 scenario? Benoit? I think on the contrary, it has considerably speeded up the awareness that we have about how we produce and use energy. We have seen in many fields solutions that are just not acceptable, and they have become acceptable. We have accepted the fact that we will need intermediary solutions also. Just take a look at what's happening in Europe right now in terms of accepting gas in France, nuclear energy here in France. The rules of balancing the different energies are changing in how we balance them. So as far as hydrogen is concerned, all of Asia, Japan, Korea had developed that energy source, whereas the rest of the world was a bit doubtful about it. The Middle East is getting into it right now. Europe's speeding up. All countries in Europe are speeding up, and North America, the United States in particular, really doubling up. So the war in Ukraine has been a catalyzer, a catalyst, and the process is speeding up, so I'm rather optimistic about that. Well, what a perfect ending to our debate. I'm really sorry that red light is flashing at me. I have got to end this panel. Thank you very much to my panel members.
30 secondes pour laisser la place à la prochaine équipe. Merci.
Next session, please.